Hello and welcome to this video about how to learn multiple languages. Now, it's certainly possible to learn multiple languages, but it usually will end up slowing down your progress in the languages you're learning. Usually just because there's only a certain amount of time in the day. But there are ways you can get the most out of this process so that you can still make good progress in the languages you're learning, and also there are strategies and techniques you can implement to avoid burnout and still enjoy the process. So I'll take you through all those today. So before we get into that, it's worth just quickly going over how to learn any language. Now, I've covered this in many other videos, so I won't go into too much detail right now. I'll link to a video covering more detail in the description below. But for now, it's just worth mentioning again that to learn any language, there are three fundamental elements. These are passive learning, active learning, and practice. And this is to learn any language regardless of what script it uses, its grammar, whether it's a tonal language or not. These are fundamental to learning any language. So that means if you follow these principles, you'll be able to learn any language. And the great thing about it is, because they're like fundamental principles, they actually allow a great amount of room for you to be creative within that. You can follow any techniques you enjoy and any resources that provide content you're interested in, as long as they include or cover these fundamental principles. So actually, not only will these principles enable you to learn any language, it'll also enable you to learn any language in a way that is unique to you, that suits you, your goals, your interests, etc. So passive learning is about immersing in the language as often as possible. And the great thing about it is you don't need to concentrate. You can attach it to things you already do. For example, your commute to work, cooking, cleaning, exercise, just about anything you can think of where you don't need to be concentrating on what you're listening to. You can also apply the idea of passive learning to reading, but of course you do need to be focusing on that task when you're doing that. So slightly different in that sense, but even so, you could still read an article casually on your commute to work if you're on the bus or the train, for example. So passive learning, it's not only a fundamental part of the process, but it's actually the easiest to implement because you can attach it to the things you already do. Now, active learning is probably the most familiar part of the process if you've spent time learning languages before at school or tried self-study before. It's when you sit down or metaphorically sit down to actually study the language, try to learn the language in a very deliberate manner. Now, back in school, you may have been familiar with conjugating verbs, learning grammar rules, writing out lists of vocabulary, and the good news is you don't need to do active learning that way at all. It's not very effective, and instead you can just focus on learning whole phrases, learning whole sentences. It's a much more enjoyable and effective way of actively learning a language. Now, the good news about active learning is it's not a case of the more hours of it a day you can do, the better, because our concentration levels only last so long usually, and also you're really getting stuck into learning the language when you're doing active learning. So the amount you can cover in even 10 minutes, or say half an hour, 40 minutes, will likely be plenty for that day, for plenty of new information for you to learn and take on board. And practice is, as you can probably tell from the name, it's practicing with first language speakers in the language you're learning. So this could be typed, audio, with voice messages or an actual call, or if you live in a country or region where the language is spoken or have a community nearby, you could practice in person as well. So those are the core principles for learning any language. Now, before we look at how to learn multiple languages and applying those principles, it's worth just quickly going over some of the benefits of learning languages and therefore of learning multiple languages. So the first one, and this is one of my main motivations when learning languages, is to deepen your cultural understanding. It's a bit cheesy, but it's true that learning a language will enable you to understand other cultures, other societies in a much more profound way than if you just read about them in your first language a little bit. Not only because you'll get access to many more resources and much more content in that language to learn about other cultures and societies relevant to that language, but also because you'll gain a new appreciation and a new understanding of all the proverbs, idioms, folk tales, etc. that make up the cultures in which that language is spoken. Another one is, it exercises your mind. I won't go into too much detail here because it's, could be a whole other topic with, scientific journals, books, references, etc. So we'll leave that for another day. But for now, it's worth just knowing that studies have shown that learning another language can enhance, your cognitive abilities. It sort of exercises your brain, help you to think in different ways, and also there's even some research to suggest that it can help combat, things like dementia, which obviously would be fantastic. Now, for more information on that, I'd recommend a book called The Bilingual Brain by Albert Costa, and I'll link to that below. Now, one more, obviously there could be lots more benefits to learning languages, but another key one many people are interested in is expanding your career opportunities. Now, as I've alluded to, I do think one of the great things about learning languages is the enjoyment you get from the process itself and the chance to connect with people from around the world. But obviously we all also have practical matters to attend to, and so another great benefit of learning languages is the career opportunities it could bring you. Now, this could be something as simple as being assigned a task at work where you need to contact companies or teams in other countries, from where you are at home, in your hometown or home city. Or it could even be, being sent on work trips to other parts of the world. But either way, it should be a very fulfilling and interesting experience, and of course, on a practical level, it should hopefully mean that it could mean higher salary, greater opportunities for advancement in your workplace, etc. So those are just some of the benefits of learning multiple languages and why it would be worth the effort of learning multiple languages. Now, just to balance that out, and not to discourage you, but it's worth mentioning just a couple of reasons why it might not be a good idea to learn multiple languages and just learn one language instead. And that's because, as I've mentioned earlier, learning multiple languages at once will usually slow down your progress. And again, just to reiterate, that's if you're learning them at the same time. Of course, this isn't to discourage you from learning multiple languages, in the long run, sort of one by one, or more or less. But if you're wanting to learn, more than one language at the same time, it is, it's more than likely that it will slow down your progress in both. And the greatest risk of that, really, aside from overwhelm and burnout, is that it can dampen your motivation because you might feel a bit disillusioned with the fact that your progress is a bit slower. And then if you combine this with, potentially feeling overwhelmed and burnt out, it might be, it might lead you to give up on learning the languages. So those are things to consider, but certainly not wanting to put you off learning multiple languages. It's just worth considering so that you can find a balance that suits you and your schedule. It's nothing wrong with learning one language and then moving on to another later. But, as I say, in the rest of this video, I'll take you through techniques and strategies to get the most out of the process so that you can learn multiple languages at the same time in as effective a way as possible. Now, just before I go into those strategies, it would be worth quickly mentioning how I personally like to go about it based on, those benefits and reasons not to I've just mentioned. I like to take a very flexible approach to learning multiple languages. Over the last, say, 5 to 6 years or so, I've learned probably about 8, 9 or 10 languages, depending on which part of the learning process you'd consider. And the key to doing that has been a flexible approach. And of course I'm not at the same level in each of those languages. Now, how I've gone about that is to avoid actively learning more than one language at the same time, whenever possible. There's been times where I've needed to actively learn more than one language at the same time for the sake of, research, commitments, or, wanting to progress to a certain point in several languages before I know I'm going to be very busy with other work commitments or other study commitments, etc. But generally, I try to only actively learn one language at a time in order to balance the workload with the rest of my life. Now, on that is going to be one of the key techniques to make learning multiple languages possible in a general sense that I'd recommend doing, which is to only actively learn one at a time, but sustain and improve the other languages you've been learning with passive learning, which is much more sustainable and manageable in terms of your daily routine. But of course, I'll also look at some techniques and strategies if you do want to actively learn more than one language at the same time. And another key approach I've used in order to learn multiple languages is to choose language pairs. And what I mean by that is I will often, once I've learnt one language to a certain level, I will then use resources in that language to start actively learning another language so that I can still sustain and improve my level in the language I had been learning whilst starting as a beginner in another language. And I'll talk in more detail later about how best to choose language pairs to get the most out of that technique. So, a fundamental thing when learning any language, but also when learning multiple languages, is to set realistic and specific goals. And I guess you could apply this to learning anything really. Now, this isn't to say that setting goals is, the most important part of the process, because, to be honest, it's much more important how you go about learning languages than having goals per se. But setting goals can be a wonderful tool for shaping your learning process and having a sense of direction and nourishing your motivation. So, you can think of it in different ways, however you want to visualize it, but I would describe it as, like an anchor securing your boat in stormy waters whilst you work below deck, or also it can function as a fixed target in the distance that provides you with direction and lights the way forward. Now, however you want to think of it, it can be a real help, especially on days when, there will be days where your motivation is naturally lower than usual, usually because of external factors. You might be really busy with other commitments, but, with your family, social life or work, etc. And that's completely normal. But having goals can help you hang in there when, you're having days where it's much harder to spend time learning a language. Now, in terms of, on a practical level, how your goals can function and help you with the process, I like to think of them in terms of steps and milestones. I like to think of them like that when I'm explaining it to students about setting goals and how it can help them. When I do this, when I'm learning languages, it's become quite automatic, so I don't need to literally think of them as steps and milestones when I do that, and hopefully that'll become the case for you as well. But for the sake of explaining theory behind it, think of them as steps and milestones. So the steps are the goals you set for what you'd like to get done each day or each week, ideally. And ideally in terms of when thinking of, your average day and balancing that out. So for example, this is just an example please do tailor this to your own schedule and situation. That's fine. If it's more or less, that's absolutely fine. But as an example, you could learn 2 phrases each day, spend at least 30 minutes immersing in the language each day, and aim to have, say, 1 conversation each week. Now, that would be a fairly light workload usually for your language learning, based on most people's schedule, because you can fit learning 2 phrases in each day reasonably conveniently. That could take you 5 to 10 minutes perhaps. At 30 minutes immersing each day, by if you have a commute to work, you should be able to fit that in. Or if you're doing cooking or housework or exercise, then that should hopefully be possible. And having 1 conversation each week, it could be a short conversation or it could be a much longer conversation, whatever is convenient for you. Now, the key thing about these steps, having these goals as steps, is that they will help you, not guarantee, but help you ensure as best as possible that you're continuing your passive and active learning each week, as well as some practice as well. And as I say, feel free to increase or decrease that workload as you see fit according to your schedule. There's no right or wrong amount. The only correct way is to make sure it's an amount of learning that fits with your life, so you don't experience burnout. Now, the other function of goals are as milestones, and these are just as essential as the steps really, because they will provide you with great motivation to keep going, and will give you a great sense of fulfillment when you reach these milestones. Now, one thing I'd suggest when you set these milestones is to not be afraid of making them very, small and realistic goals and very specific. And that way you'll get to experience that sense of fulfillment more often, and that will nourish your motivation and help you keep going. For example, writing a list for the food shop, even though you could, for example, you could look up the meaning of the food and drink you want to get from the shop and write it down. And even if you don't remember that, after the first time you go to the shop and do that, with each time you go to the shop and do that, you'll remember the items of food and drink on that list better and better each time you go. And that sort of goal is something you can achieve very quickly. You could do that on day 1 even, hypothetically, because you just need to look up the words and write them down. So that would, you'd already be getting that sense of fulfillment of ticking a milestone off your list in that way, and that will give you further motivation to keep going. So as I say, a few more examples: be able to order tea or coffee in the language you're learning, be able to talk about the weather, understand a dialogue on a certain topic or situation, understand the gist of a news report or podcast in the language, read a book in the language, and be able to have a flowing conversation in the language. Now, those are just examples. You could add many more, and as you'll have seen there, they got progressively more advanced, but don't be afraid to, add as many milestones as you like to help you keep getting that, fulfilling moment of reaching a milestone, because that will help a lot with your motivation. And don't worry about doing that. Don't worry about, you might worry that, if you're setting all these little milestones, what happens to your bigger, longer term goals. You can still have them, but what you're doing is lighting the way so that, you'll naturally reach those longer and bigger goals by aiming for these smaller milestones on your journey. And as I say, it will help a lot with your motivation, which is another key aspect of language learning, because there will be days where it feels a bit harder to sustain. So applying this to learning multiple languages, it's very important that you make your goals specific to each language you're learning, because that will, make the learning process for each language more vivid, and it will make it more motivating, because you'll have very clear motivations for why you're learning those languages. Now, for example, just say you were learning German because you now live in Germany, work in Germany, and your priorities are therefore very practical matters. For example, being able to book a doctor's appointment, that might be one of your milestone goals. However, you've also got, a trip to Vietnam planned for later in the year, and you'd love to be able to have a conversation with a taxi driver in Vietnamese, or a conversation at the market in Vietnamese, whilst you're there to, really enrich your time in Vietnam. So those would be two quite different goals, but two goals that are both very specific to each language you're learning, and therefore both with their own specific yet powerful motivations. And apply that concept to any languages you're learning. And when you do that, think of, really have a think and reflect on why it is you want to learn that language, and set your goals according to those motivations. Now, as I've sort of alluded to earlier, one thing just to reiterate is to be flexible about your goals. Adjust them to the ebbs and flows of your daily life. And as I said, how you learn languages is more important. Now, the reason it's so important to be flexible about your goals is not only because they're a tool rather than, the crux of learning a language, but most importantly because all our lives will change, quite regularly, sometimes from day to day, certainly week to week, month to month. Things come up each day, each week that we weren't expecting, and we have to dedicate time to sorting things out or doing extra work, etc. All sorts of different commitments. And so if you're too rigid about your goals, it can really impact your motivation. It can really dampen your enthusiasm when you have days where, for unforeseen reasons, you're just not able to spend as much time on the language as you'd hoped and as you'd been doing in previous days. Now, of course, if, say, it's just a random day where you happen to be much busier than usual, don't feel you have to adjust your goals at all, or certainly not adjust them dramatically, because the next day you can get back to a similar sort of routine in terms of the steps you were following. But as can also happen, I certainly often find this the case, you will have weeks, even months at times, where your schedule shifts in quite a significant way, and your goals, the goals you had previously, are just no longer appropriate for your new schedule. And so at that point, I definitely recommend adjusting your goals to fit with that, so that you can still enjoy the process and still, reach your milestones and keep going with everything. Now, and of course, and to avoid burnout, most crucially. Now, that could, that doesn't just have to be reducing your workload of your steps and milestones. If your schedule changes where you actually have more free time than you did previously, then don't be afraid to increase, the amount you try to do each day in terms of your steps, and push for, for some of the longer term milestones in a shorter time, if that suits you at a given time. And just as a final thing on that, if you want to set time frames for your milestones, don't be afraid to. That's absolutely fine. But if that's something which wouldn't be helpful for you, if you had that time pressure, then don't feel you have to do that at all. Just make it as comfortable or as challenging in that sense as suits you. Now, we'll get into strategies and techniques you can use to learn multiple languages at once in as effective a way as possible. So the key ones for this, I'll go into more detail on each of these, but the key ones are balancing active and passive learning and how you adjust that, differentiating between the languages, and there's lots of ways you can do that, and that's a very powerful way to get the most out of the process. Learning closely related languages can be very helpful, but only under certain conditions, so we'll get into that shortly. Using one language to learn another, as I've mentioned, is a very effective way. Choosing language pairs, I'll go into detail about how you can, choose pairs that make the process as enjoyable and effective as possible. And also learning about the same topics in multiple languages. This isn't something I consciously try to do, but some people do find it very helpful to do that. Now, before we get into all those, I just want to quickly mention, if this is your first time learning a language, apart from school, if it's your first time learning a language by yourself, I'd recommend ideally learning one language to intermediate level before you then start learning another. Now, this is for two reasons really. The first and most important one is to avoid overwhelm and burnout, because you'll be starting a new learning process. So whilst you become familiar with that, it's probably best just to focus on one. And also, and this is especially relevant if you're wanting to learn two languages that are similar, or two closely related languages, for example Spanish and Italian, to avoid confusion, I'd recommend learning one to an intermediate level before you then start learning the other. As if they've got a lot of shared vocabulary, then if you're starting out with both at the same time, it could be a bit confusing. But again, if your heart's set on starting both at the same time, then by all means do so and see how it goes. But don't be afraid to adapt if you're finding it a bit overwhelming or confusing. Now, the first key set of strategies revolves around balancing active and passive learning. So, just to quickly recap, your passive learning is your immersion that you can attach to things you already do, and your active learning is when you set aside time to really get stuck in learning the language. Now, there are three ways or three things relevant to balancing your active and passive learning. Now, the first sort of principle, I guess, is to use passive learning for every language you're learning, regardless of whether you're going to be actively learning it as well or not. Passive learning is something that's usually very or relatively easy to apply to your day, because you attach it to things you already do. And so you should be able to, for example, learn Spanish or listen to Spanish on your commute, and then when you do exercise in the evening, listen to Mandarin Chinese, for example. And that way you can keep moving forward with more than one language at the same time. Now, the way I'd recommend, ideally, if you haven't got other time pressures to consider, like an exam or you're having to learn a language for your company, for example, if it's just your own personal goals and motivations, then I'd recommend actively learning one language at a time whilst you passively learn in another language or several other languages. And then I will touch on how to actively learn multiple languages at the same time should you wish to, and how to get the most out of that. So, as I mentioned, using passive learning for multiple languages is not only very doable and effective, it's also a really enjoyable process. I can't recommend it highly enough. It's been, again, one of the key motivations for me learning languages is being able to, understand films and news reports and books in the languages I've been learning. And as I said, the great thing about passive learning, you can attach it to things you already do, but also use it for time to relax. So, personally, for example, for me, that would look like, watching the news in Vietnamese each day, but also watching, some interesting documentaries in Vietnamese about, infrastructure projects they're working on, or about the history of a nearby temple. And then, I'll make time to watch a news report in Mandarin Chinese later in the day, watch an online course about politics in Latin America in Spanish, watch a quick tutorial for an app in French, read a book in Italian or read an article in Italian, and watch a series or film in Portuguese, as an example. Obviously, on a given day I might not fit in all of that, but it's a really fun and rewarding way to maintain my level in those languages and even improve as well. So I'd recommend thinking about your passive learning and enjoying that process, because it's one of the most rewarding parts of learning languages. Now, of course, there's a quick caveat on that. It will become more rewarding in terms of being able to understand the things you listen to or read as your level progresses in the language. But even when you're starting out with a language, you're passive learning, you won't understand a lot of what you hear or see, when you're scanning articles and stuff or listening to podcasts, but that's fine, that's part of the process, and that's exactly why you're doing the passive learning. The more you expose your brain to the language, the more familiar you'll become with the language, so don't worry about that. And because it's passive, when you're, for example, listening to a German podcast on the way to work, and when you're a beginner in the language, you're not having to concentrate on what you're listening to. So in that sense, it doesn't matter that you can't understand it, from a boredom perspective. If you're, for example, doing exercise, it won't matter that you can't understand it because you're focusing on the exercise you're doing instead, be it a jog or in the gym. And as I said, listening to the language as often as possible will build up your familiarity with the sound patterns of the language. So it's a very crucial part of the process. So don't be put off by the fact in the earlier stages you won't understand much of what you're immersing in. It's completely normal and an essential part of the process. And yeah, as you progress with it, it will become a really enjoyable and rewarding part of that process. Now, in terms of actively learning one language at a time, as I say, this is the technique I'd recommend most, in a general sense, without obviously knowing about your own unique situation and schedule. And, just to take an example, it could be that, for your active learning, you learn Vietnamese phrases about going to the market or about the weather, or even, if you're a bit more further along in the process, about, historical terms or about politics or any deeper topic you might think of or are interested in. And then obviously you'll still be passively learning Vietnamese as part of that process. It could be listening to a podcast while you do exercise. And then to sustain and improve the other languages you've been learning, for example, you could watch a news report in Spanish for 10 minutes in the evening and quickly read an article in German, for example. Or if you like watching films or series, instead of watching a film or series in your first language, you could watch a film or series in one of the languages you're learning, say, Russian or French, etc. So yeah, that's the most sustainable way I've found over the years of maintaining and improving my level in other languages whilst still making good progress actively learning another language. Now, if you're wanting to actively learn multiple languages, I certainly don't want to discourage you from doing that. If you want to do that, by all means, give it a go. And just make sure, as I say, you're passively learning the languages each day or as many days as possible. And if, you're finding that your schedule's really quite busy and you don't have much time at all to actively learn both languages, what you can either do is, divide that time for each language you're learning. Say, for example, 10 minutes in the morning actively learning Vietnamese and 10 minutes in the evening after work actively learning Catalan, for example. But if you'd find that a bit frustrating, if you were wanting to get a bit more time spent actively learning each one, what you could do is alternate the days you focus on each one. So for example, it could be that you manage to accumulate, say, 30 minutes actively learning Vietnamese on one day, and then the next day 30 minutes, accumulative 30 minutes actively learning Italian, for example. Or you could do 2 days like that in Vietnamese, 2 days like that in Italian, just whatever you find feels best for you. There's no right or wrong way with that. But when actively learning multiple languages, there isn't going to be a perfect solution as such, usually. You might find that you have to, find flexible ways of accommodating both. Now, as I sort of touched on there, a key way to get the most out of actively learning multiple languages is to differentiate between the languages. So we'll look at how to do that now. Now, there are quite a number of ways you can do this, fortunately, and this is probably the most effective technique for getting the most out of learning multiple languages in general, not just actively learning multiple languages. Now, you could actively learn or learn languages in which you're at different levels. That's a very effective way to differentiate between them. You can choose languages from different families, like different language families, to avoid any chances of confusion, especially if you're starting both from the same level. You can use different study contexts, which is another great way to differentiate between them. You could set aside different times of day for different languages or different locations, different learning environments. And another great way is to have a hobby in each language. So what I mean by that is, attach each language to a certain hobby you have. For example, you might, if you love cooking, for example, you might start trying to watch cooking tutorials or recipes on YouTube in Spanish. And if you love sport, for example, you might follow Italian channels about Serie A, the Italian First Division, just as an example. So we'll look at these in a bit more detail. Now, using different study contexts is the one I'd recommend the most, because I'll talk about choosing languages in which you're at different levels and from different families when we talk about choosing language pairs. That's a bit more of a holistic decision. But in terms of using different study contexts, these are quite vivid and plannable aspects of your day if you choose to plan in detail. Now, just taking this example here, you could wake up and actively learn Vietnamese before work, and then on your commute you could passively learn Vietnamese by listening to a Vietnamese podcast or radio show on your commute. Now then, at lunchtime you could immerse in Spanish while you have your lunch, be it watching a series or watching a news report or even reading an article. And then on your way home from work, you might have a favourite cafe that you could make the place, or which you could set as the place where you do your active learning for Spanish each day, or as many days as possible. And then in the evening, at some point, you could passively learn Italian, be it by doing yoga or doing some exercise whilst listening to Italian music or an Italian podcast or watching an Italian series or film. Now, that's just an example. You can obviously apply that to whichever languages you're wanting to learn and apply it to your schedule. So think about, are there places you feel more focused and you could choose them for active learning, or places you feel more relaxed, and again you could choose them for active learning or use them for passive learning. And if you don't get the chance to go outside naturally as often as other people, be it because, say, you work from home, for instance, you could even differentiate between spaces in your home. You could associate passive learning with the sofa and active learning with a desk or standing up in the kitchen, for example. Whatever works for you. The important thing is you create and assign study contexts that fit with your life and your preferences. Now, in terms of learning closely related languages, it's usually a good idea to make sure you're at different levels in those languages, because otherwise they can be quite confusing. A good example is like the Romance languages like Spanish, Italian, Catalan, French, Romanian, even though it's a Romance language, would be to a lesser extent, as it's got some unique aspects that make it seem a bit different to the other Romance languages. But for ones you're probably more familiar with, like French, etc., I wouldn't recommend, for example, learning those from the beginning at the same time, because they have a lot of shared vocabulary and it could get a bit confusing. However, if you learn one of them to an intermediate level, it can then be a very powerful way for you to start learning another of those languages from the beginning, because you'll be very comfortable and familiar with a lot of words and phrases in one of the languages, and so that familiarity will actually make learning another of those languages from the beginning much easier, because you'll recognise a lot of words that are spelt similarly and even at times pronounced in not too dissimilar a way, and so you'll recognise them straight away, and that will propel your learning forward. But because of your familiarity, at an intermediate level at least in the other one, you won't get as confused, because the other ones will be more deeply ingrained in your mind by then. So yeah, that's what I'd recommend for learning closely related languages. But that isn't to say that For example, if you've got specific goals or time pressures in mind, be it because of work or study commitments, then don't be afraid to try your best to start out in both as soon as possible. For example, you could actively learn one to some extent, be it say an advanced beginner or lower intermediate, and then get cracking with the other if you're in a bit of a rush, for example. But just see how you're feeling with it, and if you're feeling a bit confused, then don't be afraid to just delay starting the other whilst you become more familiar with the other one first. And just as a quick example on that, when I was learning, I learnt French at school, but I wasn't able to understand it really apart from a bit of reading. But when I studied at the Sorbonne, that helped my French improve a lot. And then when I started my final year of university back in the UK, my dissertation research was mostly going to be in Spanish, but also Italian, Portuguese, Catalan, a bit of German, comparing fascism in Europe during the 1930s. And so at that particular time, I wasn't in a rush, but really wanted to kick on to be able to research in those languages for my final year dissertation. And so when I got back to the UK in the summer, I actively learnt Spanish for a couple of months to sort of a lower to upper intermediate level, depending on which topics. And then I used French resources to do that with Spanish as a way of making my progress faster and taking advantage of the similarity between the two languages. And I then did the same for Portuguese. I used a book in Spanish about learning Portuguese, and I did similar for Italian and Catalan. So you can find ways to make the process as effective as possible, even though, as I say, it's best to learn one to a familiar level, an intermediate level, before starting the other. Now, as I mentioned, I used French for maintaining and improving my French whilst being able to rapidly improve my Spanish through the similarity between the two languages. And the book I used for that was Assimil's L'Espagnol, book for learning Spanish. And I then did the same, as I said, with Assimil's book in Spanish for learning Brazilian Portuguese. And so I found that very effective, and a very effective way to increase my reading level in a short space of time in each of those languages so that I could do dissertation research. And more recently, I've been using Vietnamese books to improve my Chinese. So when I came to Vietnam, I started learning Vietnamese around that time, and my Chinese was actually at an intermediate level at that time, but because of other work and study commitments, I'd only ever been able to sort of learn it sporadically. And so I'd often find that even though I'd make progress, my level would then fall back a bit because I'd never have time to then keep building on my progress as much as I would have liked. So that meant when I got to Vietnam and really wanted to learn Vietnamese, I had to decide to set Chinese aside to begin with. Even though I tried on occasions to actively learn both at the same time, but it just sort of held back progress in both, really. So eventually I decided, I need to build up my Vietnamese to an intermediate to advanced level, and then what I can do is come back to learning Chinese, from an intermediate level, and get my Chinese up to a higher intermediate and advanced level through Vietnamese, and that way I could maintain and improve my Vietnamese whilst being able to properly focus on learning Chinese. So as you can see in the picture, I've been using the Vietnamese version of the HSK6 textbook to improve my Chinese recently, and also some books like the one in the bottom picture where there's a series of news articles there in Chinese with a Vietnamese translation, so that I can keep improving in both languages at the same time. But even though I tried to do stuff like that when I got to Vietnam, the other way round, I thought about using Chinese to learn Vietnamese, I found that I really needed to improve a lot in one to be able to use it for improving in the other. So in that case it meant improving my Vietnamese as fast as possible so that I was at a high enough level in Vietnamese to use it to improve my Chinese, which I'm now doing and enjoying when I have time to. It's been a busy year, but I've enjoyed it so far, and I'm looking forward to continuing it when my schedule allows. Now, Just quickly on Vietnamese in terms of time scale, if you're wondering, for Vietnamese it happened to be that after about a year and a half learning the language, I was able to get level 5 in the official Vietnamese proficiency exam of the University of Social Sciences and Humanities of the National University in Hanoi. And the highest level is level 6, so level 5 would be probably B2 to C1, although to be honest I'd probably define it as B2 personally, but it would be B2 to C1 on the CEFR, if you're familiar with that, the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages. And yeah, from that level I've found that I'm at a level where I'm able to use Vietnamese to learn Chinese, or improve my Chinese rather. So tying that into how to choose language pairs, I'd recommend taking a bit of time to consider how two languages complement each other. Now, that doesn't necessarily just have to be about how similar they are, it could be how they complement your learning goals. And yeah, it will depend on your situation, your goals, and also, of course, how the languages complement each other themselves in terms of how closely related they are. Now, as I mentioned, with the Romance languages, I found their shared vocabulary a huge help in making very fast progress, over just a matter of months, a couple of months in each one, because they had so much shared vocabulary. But for example, taking the example of Vietnamese and Chinese, Vietnamese has a lot of loanwords from Chinese because of a very long history of Chinese political rule in parts of northern and central Vietnam from around the 1st millennium BCE to the 1st century BCE to the 10th century CE. But even though there's all these Chinese loanwords in Vietnamese, and if you actually take a close look at them and compare them, you can see the similarities. I actually haven't found that to be a big help at all when learning Vietnamese. I don't find them similar enough for that to be helpful, and I'm not sure if it's because they're both tonal languages where each syllable can carry meaning. I just, for some reason haven't found that helpful. But what I have found really helpful with Vietnamese and Chinese has been the fact that they are both tonal languages, and Vietnamese, depending on which region, but usually has more tones than Mandarin Chinese. Having to get to grips with Vietnamese tones really helped improve my appreciation of tonal languages in general, and how to learn them even more effectively. And so when I've been using Vietnamese to go back and improve my Chinese, I've come back to Mandarin Chinese with a sort of reinvigorated perspective on learning tones, and that's been helpful for me in improving my Mandarin Chinese recently. Now, of course, that's not to say I neglected tones when learning Mandarin Chinese previously, before I'd started learning Vietnamese, but it's enabled me to get even more out of the process since learning Vietnamese. And of course, the shared vocabulary between the two isn't useless, I just haven't found it as useful as I have with Romance languages. Now, a final thing on that is that I've also chosen Vietnamese and Chinese as a language pair because they're two languages I prioritise at the moment in terms of active learning. I don't really actively learn Vietnamese anymore because I'm at a pretty high level in it now, but it's still my priority because I live in Vietnam, so I still like to take the chance to spend as much time on Vietnamese as possible. And so being able to maintain and improve my Vietnamese whilst focusing on Mandarin Chinese is ideal for me with my goals, because I also want to keep improving my Mandarin Chinese and be able to learn classical Chinese for doing historical research about Vietnamese history and Chinese history. So yeah, that makes sense for me, having them as a language pair. Another example, I haven't started learning Japanese or Korean, but I plan to in the future, and having done a bit of research about learning them, apparently the grammar of both can both seem quite complicated to people whose first language is English, but their grammars are quite similar. And because Korean has its own alphabet that's renowned for being, very logical and not too difficult to learn. Depending on who you ask, it can take a few hours to a few days. And so an example of how to go about learning those as a language pair would be to learn Korean first, because the writing system would be a much smaller hurdle than Japanese, with its sort of free scripts, I guess, like hiragana, katakana, and then kanji, the Japanese versions of Chinese characters. So you could learn Korean first with the smaller hurdle for the writing system, get familiar with Korean grammar, and then you could start learning Japanese with a much more familiar sense of Japanese grammar due to its similarity to Korean grammar, for example. And then you'd mainly just be focusing on getting to grips with the Japanese writing system or writing systems. And of course, if, say for example, you happen to have learned Mandarin Chinese before, as the case for me, then learning Japanese will be even less of a jump than it might otherwise have been. So you can plan your language learning and your language learning goals for multiple languages based on the similarities and differences between languages, and also your goals. You can combine the two to make holistic decisions that will be most effective for you and also most enjoyable for you. Now, just to quickly mention, another technique some people like to do is learn about the same topics in multiple languages. Now, I wouldn't necessarily recommend this if you'd find it a bit confusing, but if you try it out and actually find it to be very effective, then by all means give that a go. It's not something I consciously try to do when I'm learning languages. If it happens, that's fine, but I much prefer to just let my learning be guided by what I'm interested in. For example, there was a big storm, like basically a hurricane in Vietnam last September, and I spent actually a lot of time during that reading lots of news articles, watching lots of news reports about storm systems and the East Sea, how they were building in the East Sea and then making their way westwards. And so I learnt a lot of words and phrases related to that in Vietnamese at that time, but I don't know how to talk about that sort of stuff in Mandarin Chinese, for example, because I've been focusing on other topics in that language. So I just base it on where my interests and goals take me in each language. If they happen to overlap, that's grand, and sometimes they will, especially of course on more rudimentary topics, more foundational topics like food, or asking basic questions about people's name and that sort of thing. But when you get into more advanced and niche topics, then they'll naturally diversify a bit. But if you want to try out really focusing on a certain topic on each of the languages you're learning, by all means give it a go. And then in terms of how to learn many languages at the same time, as I say, this isn't something I like to do personally, certainly in terms of active learning. What I do to do this, as I mentioned, is I actively learn one language, or at most, say a couple of languages at the same time if I need to, and then sustain and improve the other languages I've learned by continuing to do at least some passive learning from time to time in those languages. Now, if you want to actively learn multiple languages at the same time, by all means give that a go if you'd like. I certainly wouldn't want to discourage you doing that, but just see how you feel with it. Now, in terms of inspiration, I'd recommend watching what's now quite an old video on YouTube by a professor called Alexander Argeyes, I think is how you pronounce his name. And you may even have heard of him if you've looked up language learning on YouTube before. There's a video where he was interviewed by someone about his language learning routine, and he actively learned many languages, or did at that time. This was about, I think it was like maybe 15 years ago, this video. And it's remarkable when you watch the video, like he sets aside, his whole day back then for learning each language, like many, many languages. So if that's something you're interested in, I'd recommend that video for inspiration. And just type on YouTube Professor Alexander language routine, something like that, His surname is spelled Arguelles off the top of my head. Yeah, give that a search and it should come up. It's quite an old video and you might find that inspirational. Likewise, if that doesn't sound like your cup of tea at all, don't worry, it's not mine either. My reasons for learning languages are to enjoy the process and learn about other cultures, societies, histories, and connect with people from around the world. But that's not I wouldn't want that to be at the expense of, having to actively learn many languages each day. That would take out the enjoyment from the process for me, and either way I simply wouldn't have time to do that. So if you're in a similar boat, don't worry, that's also completely normal. But just follow your interests and goals. One thing to mention about choosing languages from different families is that this can really help if you are wanting to actively learn more than one language at the same time, because it will enable you to start both from the beginning. For example, if you're actively learning Mandarin Chinese and actively learning Spanish from scratch from the beginning, there's not going to be any confusion involved, because they're not related languages really, although that's another debate about whether all languages have one common ancestor or not. But for the sake of simplicity, they're not related languages really. They don't have any cognates, shared vocabulary in terms of the roots of the words, and Spanish grammar has like verb conjugations, Mandarin Chinese doesn't have that, etc. So they're very different languages, and so if you're starting both from scratch, you're not going to get confused. So if you are wanting to actively learn more than one language from the start, then choosing languages from different language families can be a great way to do that. Now, when you're learning any language, but especially when you're learning multiple languages, there are various challenges to overcome as part of the learning process. Now, when bearing in mind your situation and your goals, it's worth considering whether learning multiple languages is worth it, because even though, the results of learning multiple languages are probably something anyone would love to have, being able to understand and speak various languages, the actual process will decide whether or not it's worth it in comparison to your goals. So we'll discuss that briefly. And then building a study routine you enjoy is a crucial part of making the process less of a burden and making it something you enjoy rather than something you have to do. And that's specific, not specifically, but especially for days when, your motivation's a bit low or you have less time. If you have a routine you enjoy, it will help you to keep going. And as a consequence of that, avoid burnout, which is one of the biggest challenges when learning a language, and especially when learning multiple languages. So we'll cover that. Building a supportive learning environment is, it's up to you in terms of the details of it. There's many ways you can do that, but as a core principle, it's a very helpful way to overcome the challenges of learning multiple languages, such as avoiding burnout again, and again, getting more out of the process, making it more enjoyable by having, for example, a community to help each other out and rely on when your motivation's a bit lower. And speaking of motivation, there are various motivational techniques and rewards you can use to help yourself keep going and sustain your motivation when learning multiple languages. So we'll look at those techniques. And the core principle tying all of these together is to do what's right for you. If you do what's right for you, based on your goals, your situation, your interests, then you have a much better chance of being able to learn multiple languages, to be able to keep going. So we'll cover all of these now, and then you can apply that together with the strategies and techniques we've discussed to get started learning multiple languages. Now, in terms of whether learning multiple languages is worth it, only you can answer this question, because your learning journey will be unique to you. Everyone's circumstances, experience, goals and interests will be unique to them. So all you can do is bear all that in mind and decide whether the extra time pressure of learning multiple languages will make it more of a burden than something you enjoy, and if that's the case, it might not be worth doing. Now, of course, if you're wanting to learn multiple languages for a very specific work commitment, study commitment, or an exam, then you may feel you don't have a choice, in which case you have to try your best and use the techniques and strategies I've mentioned as best as you can. And yeah, just consider how it's all going to balance with other areas of your life. You know, for example, again, this is just an example, but if, you know, actively learning an extra language instead of just one language meant you didn't have time to, you know, go watch, you know, your kids play football at the weekend, for example, then I guess for most people, certainly for myself, that wouldn't seem worthwhile to me. But just weigh up how it feels for you. You know, if, as I said, if you've got external commitments that you can't avoid, like an exam, or your company's demanding of you that you learn a certain language, then you may not have a choice in those situations. But if you do have a choice, then yeah, only you can decide if it's worth it or not. But there's no right or wrong answer. The right answer is only, you know, what makes sense for you. Now, building a study routine you enjoy, you know, I cover this in another video, so I won't go into too much detail. I'll link to that video below, but just remember, flexibility is key. You know, you have to adapt your learning routine to your schedule and other areas of your life, and use your hobbies and your passions. If you do that, you'll look forward to your language learning because you'll be incorporating it to things you already enjoy. You know, you can lean on passive learning as well so that it becomes automatic. You know, for example, you know, if you take a shower each morning, then get into the habit of sticking the radio on in Spanish each morning as you shower, and it'll become automatic. Likewise, listening to something on your commute or whilst doing exercise. And that way, not only will you be able to keep making progress consistently, but you'll also take away, you know, some decision fatigue about whether you're able to spend time immersing at a given part of the day or not, because it will become automatic. And yeah, just to come back to flexibility, please do adapt it to the changes, the ebbs and flows in your life. If your schedule changes to the point where it's become really difficult for you to fit in the amount of time you'd wanted to spend for active learning or practice, for example, then don't be afraid to readjust your routine and give yourself a bit of grace. You know, let yourself spend less time on it for a certain period whilst you ride out or deal with, you know, a more intense schedule at work during that time period, for example. Just play it by ear and prioritise your mental and physical well-being and other priorities of your life, like family, friends, etc. Now, all of that, as I said, is key to avoiding burnout. And in terms of key principles to remember for avoiding burnout, which are, you know, linked to what I just mentioned, be sure to pace yourself. And as I said, pacing yourself means aligning it with the ebbs and flows of the other areas of your life. Take scheduled breaks if that helps. You know, don't be afraid to, you know, as part, you know, if you're someone who likes to plan your routine in quite a lot of detail, don't be afraid to incorporate breaks inside of that. You know, don't feel you have to use every possible minute of your spare time for active learning, for example. It's also important to set aside time to just chill out a bit, just to let your brain relax and refresh so that you can learn more effectively during the time when you are learning. And another key thing to do if you're starting to feel a bit jaded with the process is to try diversifying the resources you're using, especially for, say, passive learning. If you're finding that you're bored of the podcast you were listening to or bored of the series you were watching in Italian, then change to another one, and it might reinvigorate your routine and your sense of enjoyment, and you'll look forward to it more. And again, that ties into the core principle I've mentioned throughout about being flexible. Prioritize, you know, your mental and physical health throughout the process, because, you know, you should do that in and of itself, but also if you do that, you've got a much better chance of being able to keep going with the process. And the sort of fundamental reason that's so important is, you know, contrary to popular belief online, it seems, with language learning, one of the most common reasons people don't end up reaching their goals in a language is because they stop learning. It's as simple as that usually. So many people, be it friends, family or students, have asked me about, how do they learn a language, or how do they get back to learning a language, or why weren't they able to learn a language previously when they were at school or when they've tried to themselves. And quite often, aside from, there might be, they may not be following the best approach for learning languages, as I mentioned, passive learning, active learning and practice, but also very often they'll also mention that they've been doing some things which are good, like they'll have been trying to learn phrases, and they'll have even tried doing a little bit of passive learning, albeit not enough. But the reason they didn't reach their goals is they stopped. They'll have given up, not because, they're, that's not a slight on them. They'll have given up because with the learning process, they'll have either got burnt out, where they couldn't sustain what they were doing because their schedule changed with other areas of their life, and they didn't adapt their schedule to fit with that, or they weren't aware of the process of learning languages, where there's a lot of days where you won't notice your progress, and so it's very important to be aware of that, be aware that it's a cumulative process in order for your motivation to not be affected by those days where it's not obvious you're making progress. So yeah, a key reason people give up is because they're not being flexible with their routine, and they feel disillusioned and disenchanted with the progress and give up. Keeping going is absolutely essential to learning a language and to learning multiple languages. So be flexible, follow the techniques and strategies I mentioned so that you can keep going with the language. And I'll link below to a video I'll be making on how to be consistent in learning a language, because it's a whole other topic that warrants, an even more detailed discussion. Now, just as a quick tip, I came across recently reading a book called Zen, The Art of Simple Living by Shunmyo Masuno. It's got loads of great little tips about how to, get more out of your day, but not in a potentially unhealthy, hyper-productive sense, but in a sense of feeling a bit more in control of your day, like you can take time to enjoy and relax during your day and live a bit more simply. One of the tips was to try waking up 15 minutes earlier. Now, of course, I'd recommend doing this and using it to get more time, say, actively learning a language you're learning, for example, but you can also use this time however you want. If you just used that extra 15 minutes each morning to relax and feel in control of your day, then that will also have great benefits for your mental and physical health, and therefore for the rest of the process, learning languages. So I'd recommend giving that a go and using that time however works best for you. In terms of building a supportive learning environment, there's various ways you can do this, but the core principles are, being part of a community, or if you're whatever communities you're already a part of, seeing how that can be a supportive part of your language learning. For example, it could mean mentioning your goals to your friends and family so that they can check in on you, see how they're going and spur you on, but also comfort you if you've found that you can't learn as much as you want because you're busier than usual with work and other commitments at a given time. You can also, use technology to do this. It doesn't just have to be people in person. It could be apps like Tandem and HelloTalk, which are great for practicing languages online, with language exchange partners. You could also, with a language exchange partner, set goals together so that you keep pushing keep pushing each other forward and helping each other to achieve your goals. You could think that, one evening you're going to help them improve their English, for example, and then the next evening they're going to dedicate a similar amount of time to help you with a language you're learning, and so on. So there's lots of different ways you can build a supportive learning environment, and yeah, just choose the ways which make sense to you, and for people the communities you're a part of. Or, as I say, if you don't happen to know that many people, then look for communities you can join as well, be it online or in person, because there's lots of people around the world learning languages, and there may be people in your local area learning languages as well. So yeah, see what you can find and see what works best for you. Now, just as a quick caveat on that, don't worry about you don't have to go overboard with all that if it's not something that feels natural to you. If you're a bit of an introvert, then don't feel you have to join loads of groups and tell everyone about your language learning goals and stuff. If you want to take things a bit more quietly and you prefer just chipping away at stuff by yourself, that's also fine. But regardless of whether you're quite introverted or not, no matter what personality we have, as a general rule, we do thrive in community. Just you can decide to what extent that applies to you in terms of how much time you spend for community as part of your language learning process. So there's no right or wrong way. Now, in terms of motivational techniques and rewards, there's several ways you can go about this, and another thing that will be unique to you is how deliberate and specific you want to be with them. So, for example, you could be quite meticulous with it and use visual progress tools like apps, habit trackers and stuff, but you don't have to be as detailed and specific as that if you don't want. It could just be taking time to appreciate your progress. For example, for me, what this tends to look like is, every day when I speak Vietnamese with people, be it, at work or at the market or, in just any daily situation, I always feel very grateful to have been able to have that experience, because I remember the time, when you start out learning any language, being able to do that is relatively far away at that point because you're starting out. So when you are able to do that, it's worth just taking just a tiny bit of time, to reflect on that and appreciate the progress you've made and feel grateful for, in a general sense, having the opportunity to have that experience, but also grateful for the time and effort you put into that process. Now, as I say, you don't have to literally think about it. It could just be, a feeling. Like for me, when I go to the market, when I'm driving home on the moped, I'll just have a feeling of gratitude for that experience. So it could be as simple as that, or as part of appreciating your progress, and if you're wanting to tick off your progress on habit trackers, you could set rewards for the milestones you reach. It could be, as I say, it could be as simple as what I just mentioned about just feeling grateful on the drive home after going to the market, or it could be something a bit more tangible, like, treating yourself to something, having a takeaway, whatever suits you. You'll know what works for you. But yeah, don't be afraid to reward yourself for your progress. It can be a key part of sustaining your motivation. And, learning a language, especially learning multiple languages, it is a lot of time and effort. Even though using the techniques and strategies I've mentioned, it will hopefully be a very enjoyable process. Regardless of how you go about it, it does take time and effort. And so, yeah, don't be shy of rewarding yourself for that along the way. Now, again, this is, related to that, but in terms of sustaining your motivation, and especially when learning multiple languages, is to remember the specific goals I mentioned earlier. So, when you inevitably have days where your motivation feels a bit lower than normal, think about and take time to reflect again on the specific goals and motivations you have for learning that language. So, say for instance, your work's especially busy one day, and usually you'd actively learn Vietnamese in the morning and actively learn Spanish at a cafe on the way home from work. But on that day, your team's been assigned some extra work you need to complete when you get home. Think to yourself, if you're feeling really tired and like you need to conserve as much energy as possible to get that extra work done when you get home, you've got a decision to make, and there's no right or wrong answer. You can either, if you really think you're going to be too burnt out, then just conserve your energy, go home, and when you get home in the evening, complete the work that's been assigned. Or if you feel, your mental and physical health is, going to be all right, it's just going to be a bit of a grim afternoon and evening from an effort perspective, then reflect on your motivation for learning Spanish. Think about how happy you'd be if you had the chance to be able to, say, speak with a taxi driver in Madrid for that trip you've got coming up, or with fans outside a football match you're attending later this year. And that might help you, find the motivation to still go to the cafe on your way home from work and actively learn Spanish before you then go home and have to do that extra work you've been assigned. Now, as I say again, there's no right or wrong way. If you can tell, because you'll know yourself, if fitting both in, going to the cafe like you usually would on the way home from work and then doing that extra work is going to be too much, you're going to be too burnt out, then skip the cafe. That's absolutely fine. But if you think it's just going to be a case of being a little bit grim, like you're having to drag yourself there, then remember your motivations and you may find you're able to do so. So again, that's just an example. Think about your motivations for the languages you're learning. It could be buying fruit at the market in Vietnamese, understanding your favourite Korean films, and so on. So to summarise all of that, it comes back to doing what's right for you. So that's the key thing to remember when learning any language, but especially when learning multiple languages. Focus on resources you enjoy. And what I mean by that is not just like the medium it's on, be it a YouTube video or a certain, a well thought out textbook that allows you to follow the principles of active learning. But it could also be, the content itself, focus on topics you're interested in, stuff like that. And make your approach to learning languages as comfortable or as challenging as you need. There's no set way of going about that. You might come across advice online where people say, oh no, you've got to push yourself, or no, prioritize comfort, that's the most important thing. Both of those can be true. It depends on you. Some people respond well to keeping things comfortable and therefore sustainable, perhaps, in their case, and that's absolutely fine. By all means do that. But you might also, you might be a person who thrives on really pushing yourself, setting quite demanding challenges of yourself to spur you on to do something. For example, if, going back to that example of the cafe on the way home from work learning Spanish, if you are someone who need that challenge to really push yourself and say, you've got a really specific goal in mind and you're going to have to do that active learning at the cafe that day to reach that goal, then you might find that is exactly what helps push you to find enough motivation to do that. If you're that type of person, you might find a more comfortable approach doesn't work, because if you don't have a certain goal in mind, you might think, well, I don't really need to stop at the cafe after work, I'm just going to take it easy today. Now, as I said, there's nothing wrong with that if that's what you'd prefer to do, but if you know that you find something that's more of a challenge is what helps make you put in the effort that's required, then don't be afraid to push yourself as well. Just do whatever's right for you. And again, if that means taking a more comfortable approach where you prioritize flexibility, then that's also absolutely fine, and that's what I'd recommend doing in a general sense, to prioritize your mental and physical health so that you can enjoy the process of learning languages. If you want to find resources you'd enjoy, or if you'd like more information about the learning process, we've got all sorts of resources on the How to Learn Languages website, howtolearnlanguages.info. Lots more videos on the YouTube channel at How to Learn Languages, and if you've got any questions, please feel free to email me at contact@howtolearnlanguages.info, and I'll get back to you promptly. I'd be more than happy to help. And if you need, any advice with your learning process, say for example you're trying to learn multiple languages at the moment, and you're trying to, you're thinking about the advice I've mentioned in this video and how to apply it to your situation, feel free to email me and ask me, for my opinion on that. If you'd find that helpful, I'd be more than happy to help. So yeah, I hope you enjoy learning the language you're learning, and if it's, if you're going to be learning multiple languages, I hope you enjoy it and are able to find the right balance for your situation and goals.